welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille, and today we're talking about beginnings. So, since I covered all of my world building and character and outlining videos, I'm jumping in this week and for the next couple of weeks all about drafting. So today we are going to begin at the beginning with beginnings. So we have our outline, we have our characters, we have our settings and our world, but where do we actually start the story? What scene do we begin drafting? This is going to cover everything from middle grade to YA to adult, but I am going to throw out a little disclaimer here. Middle grade and YA books, the general rule of thumb is that everything should happen faster, whereas in adult, you have a little bit more room. So the idea here is, at least for me, this is the way I do my outline and sort of build my chapters. Before I start going into the novel, I know if it's going to be a YA or an adult book, and that way I can gauge how long my chapters are. I'm going to be speaking in chapter length so that this will apply to everyone. But for example, if I'm writing a YA book, my chapter range or my chapter length will range usually from 3,000 words to 7,000 words, depending on the chapter arc. Whereas if I'm writing an adult, my chapters will range anywhere from 5,000 words to over 10,000 words, depending. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to be talking in chapters. So the main thing here about beginnings is, the biggest problem that I've had that I've only just recently gotten over because I have recently just gotten decent at plot is I always wanted to tell character stories. I love the idea of telling stories about people. However, the pitfall with this is that after I create my characters with all of this backstory, I think, well, I have to show the reader all of this backstory and all of the terrible or wonderful things that happened to them while they were growing up so that the reader can understand why the character makes the decisions that they make going into the actual story of the novel. The problem with that is the beginning of my books, when I first started writing, were all this huge chunk of scenes that was basically just boring, crappy backstory, and then the story didn't start until all the way over here, which left me with really long manuscripts. The first young adult book that I wrote was like 150,000 words, which is just way too long. So that's the thing, is we don't want to, yes, we did build all these characters in this world and all of these things, but we don't want to start with that because it's very boring. The general rule of thumb for any exciting story or for any, tale, I talked about this in my last video, but a story is not just a sequence of events. A story is a sequence of events that affect each other. Things happen because this happened. That happened because this happened. That happened because this happened, and so on and so forth. A story where things just happen that aren't necessarily all related are things like nonfiction, like memoirs. And it's very rare that these types of stories are done well outside of a nonfiction memoir. There are only three that really come to mind. The first one, Jane Eyre. We basically see her growing up. It's a coming of age story. But what pulls us through Jane Eyre is that Jane is very interesting, but she's also a very strong woman in this time period where women didn't have a lot of options and things like this. In fantasy, there's the Farseer trilogy and there is Kingkiller. And both Robin Hobb and Pat Rothfuss didn't focus so much on plot. It's literally a coming of age story for both these characters. And all of the events aren't very connected, but they focus on other aspects of their stories to really pull the reader through. And it's a lot more work to write a memoir style fantasy fiction story and make it interesting, you know, and King Killer, it is the world, and Quoth as a character is very interesting, and the language is beautiful. That's what pulls us through, like, the whole first 100 pages of the story. At least is what happened for me. Same thing with Farseer. It was, you know, the inciting incident did happen very early. Fitz was brought to, was his grandfather gave him to his father's whatever, and that was kind of the inciting incident. But then the story started to kind of slow down as, you know, Fitz is moved to Buckkeep Town and kind of tries to acclimate to this court-style life and being a bastard and all of these things. So that kind of storytelling that I essentially was trying to tell at the very beginning, I did very poorly, and it's almost more difficult. So the general rule of thumb, no matter what story or what genre you're writing in, is to have your inciting incident end of first chapter or beginning of chapter 2. And, you know, it's your inciting incident, if you're writing romance, is the two characters meet, their eyes meet across the room, and, you know, they see each other, they meet, or they come into conflict with each other if it's this sort of thing, or, you know, their really close friendship is shown in the very beginning that will eventually turn into a love story. You know, with a thriller, it's your inciting incident, or, you know, the first thing you would want to show in a thriller would be a quick moving car chase or someone fleeing from the constables or what have you, to promise the reader this is going to be a quick-paced story. If you're writing a mystery, then your inciting incident would be a body on the floor. Or if it's an adventure, then the inciting incident would be your main character leaving to go off on said adventure. If you're writing horror, then your inciting incident would be a spooky ghost. I don't know. But it is this idea that end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, you need to kick off the main plot of the story. So this brings us back around to, what is the beginning? You said to begin at the beginning. Well, where is the beginning? What is that first scene that our reader needs to see? My two main tips is the first scene of your story needs to introduce your main character. If you're writing epic fantasy, or if you have multiple POVs, or if you have just a big scope story in general, start with one character, your one main character. The second thing is to show that main character in their normal. What is regular to them? You are essentially setting a status quo for your main character, and the inciting incident is what disrupts that main character out of their normal. So first, I'm going to start with the main things to not do, and then we'll jump into the things that you should do. So the not do. Do not open your story with your main character waking up or dreaming about something. Totally cliches, very boring. However, it all depends on the type of story you're telling. If you're writing a science fiction story where things like sleep and dreams are being studied, then that's fine. But if you are just using this type of scene to introduce your character and show how cool their dream is, no one cares. That's boring. Don't do that. Second thing, do not do a mirror scene. We all know it. It is the scene where we are introduced to the character, and then the second line is, oh, and then said character looked in the mirror, or oh, I looked in the mirror and talked about my brown hair and blue eyes and blah, 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 blah. That's boring. Your reader does not care what your character looks like. The thing about written media and books, just in general, is that us writers have the ability to share with the reader what's inside the characters' heads. That is the best use of the written word, and the best use, in my opinion, of this written word media. You know, if I cared what the characters look like, that the character, you know, is beautiful but doesn't think they're beautiful, well, then I'd watch a movie. It's the difference between a written media and a visual media. What your character looks like is not that interesting in a book, as opposed to how your character is acting in the scene, what your character is thinking. the things your character is saying to another character, and all this sort of stuff. Action scenes and fight scenes. If you're writing a thriller, yes, that's okay. However, if your opening scene is this big battle with all of these characters that I don't know, I'm not going to give a shit about anything that happens to anyone. And it would just be really boring, and I would be so confused. Because usually when this type of thing happens, the author doesn't take the time to set the scene first, so I don't even know where anyone is. It's just a jumble of stuff that I can't understand. So no fight scenes or whatever unless you're doing a thriller and it's the James Bond idea where you just want to show how badass your MC is. History of the world. Do not open your story with an info dump history of the world. Yes, you created this full world and setting and cultures and languages and all this fun stuff. But if you put that all in the beginning of your story, it's going to read like a history textbook. Who actually enjoyed reading a history textbook in school? Not me. Boring. Super boring. And you're biased because it's your world that you created, so you think it's probably the coolest thing since sliced bread. To your reader, it's not. What's interesting about your world is how your main character sees it and interacts with it and comes into conflict with it. So if you have world elements you need to introduce, scatter it out throughout your story as it's relevant or as it's necessary. Don't drop it all in the front in a prologue. That's lazy. And dialogue. You can open your story with dialogue, but do not open your story with dialogue without introducing the characters. Because two people, unbeknownst to the reader, exchanging dialogue, they're going to be so confused that they're probably just going to miss everything that was said or any relevant information included in that conversation. So if you want to open with a scene of dialogue, make sure to not only have dialogue tags, but describe the people who are talking, what their relationship is together, where they are, etc. Things to open with. This is not by any means a full list, it's just some ideas. And like I said, this is the very first scene of your book before we get into the inciting incident. This is, for me, it's the slow part. It's the low part. It's where we are trying to hook the reader with our interesting character or their interesting family dynamic or an interesting aspect of the world or the magic or the school they go to or the job they have. So a good opening scene is to show your main character interacting with a friend or a family member in an interesting way. Perhaps they're exchanging witty banter. Perhaps they're in a library studying some cool magic. Perhaps someone is telling someone else a clever story. Perhaps people are traveling from one place to another, etc. Working, you could show your character in their job. This is a good way to sort of establish what the theme of your story might be. Say you're writing a contemporary story and you have a character in some menial job that they hate. You can show your main character's normal life of being dissatisfied and unfulfilled with their menial job. And your characters could be at a restaurant or an event or a show. But the main thing is to open that first scene with your character's normal, with a hook, and with someone or something that they're interacting with. And this is the perfect scene to go before we go into the inciting incident. It's so that your reader can get a hint of who your character is before you, the author, throw all this terrible crap at your main character. Now, if you're writing, and all these tips are pretty much for if you have like one main point of view character, but if you're writing a big scope story or you have multiple POVs, the same rules still apply. If you have multiple POVs, start with just one character and introduce their normal, introduce whatever, and then go into their inciting incident. And then you could jump to the viewpoint of another character and sort of show their normal and then show their inciting incident. At that point, it's really just a juggling game, and a lot more difficult than just writing a straight story with a straight timeline and one POV, but that's my general rule of thumb, is just start with your character in their normal beginning of the chapter, interacting with their loved ones or at work or at an event or what have you, and then disrupt that. It's a great way to start a story. It is foolproof. And yeah, that's all I got. So I don't have a resource this week. It's kind of hard to find very gripping resources on the idea of drafting, because writing in general is a sort of thing that you just have to sit down and do it to really understand what your story is about and where your specific story begins. So no resource this week, but next week we will jump into chapters, chapter length, what makes a chapter, and all those fun things. So I will see you guys then. But for now, as always, you should be writing stuff.